I used to believe some objects carry the weight of entire lifetimes, not because of their price or their shine, but because of the moments they silently witnessed. My ring was one of those things. It rested on my hand for decades, catching light during ordinary mornings and long, sleepless nights alike, absorbing everything I never said out loud. When I look back now, it feels as though my life can be traced through its surface, every scratch earned, every dulling of gold earned honestly through time. It came to me when I was young and unsure, when love still felt like a promise rather than a responsibility. My husband placed it on my finger with hands that trembled slightly, not from doubt, but from the seriousness of forever. Over the years, that ring stayed with me through moves, through scraped knees and school uniforms, through hospital corridors that smelled of antiseptic and fear. It was there when I learned how heavy motherhood could feel, and when grief quietly took its seat at our table after my husband was gone. I was never a woman who asked for much. I believed in holding families together with patience rather than force, with silence rather than confrontation. I learned early that peace often demanded swallowing discomfort, letting small hurts pass unanswered. The ring became a quiet reminder of that belief, steady, constant, unchanging. When things felt unstable, I would turn it gently with my thumb, grounding myself in its familiar presence. In our home, generations blended under one roof, each carrying their own expectations and unspoken tensions. My daughter entered our lives with politeness and careful smiles, and I welcomed her the way I had welcomed everything else, with trust first, questions later. I wanted harmony more than certainty. I wanted to believe love multiplied when shared, not divided. That is why I didn't panic immediately when I realized I hadn't felt the ring on my finger in a while. I told myself I must have taken it off while washing dishes or set it somewhere safe without remembering. Life had been full, noisy, crowded with responsibilities. Things get misplaced. That is what I told myself again and again, because the alternative felt too sharp to consider. Still, unease crept in quietly, not as fear, but as a thin discomfort I couldn't quite shake. The ring had always been exactly where I expected it to be. Its absence felt like a skipped heartbeat, small but impossible to ignore. I noticed myself watching hands more closely around the house, noticing movements I would have once overlooked. Nothing obvious, nothing I could name. I kept my thoughts to myself. I always had. Accusations, even imagined ones, felt like cracks in a wall I had spent years maintaining. And yet, somewhere beneath my calm exterior, something sacred felt disturbed, not broken, not lost, just unsettled, as if a quiet line had been crossed. And I hadn't yet found the words to acknowledge it. The unease I carried from that first realization did not fade overnight. It followed me into the next morning, clinging to the edges of an otherwise ordinary day. Sunlight filtered through the curtains as it always had, dust floating lazily in the air, the house breathing with its familiar sounds. I moved through my routine on instinct, boiling water, folding laundry, straightening cushions. Everything felt slightly out of place, as if the rhythm of my life had shifted by a fraction I couldn't correct. It wasn't until later, when the house fell briefly quiet, that I returned to the bedroom and opened the small wooden box where the ring usually rested. I remember the weight of the lid in my hand, the faint creak of its hinge, movements so practiced I didn't need to look. But when I did look, my breath stalled. The box lay open and empty, its soft lining pressed flat, like a pillow that no longer remembered the shape of a head. For a moment, I simply stared. My mind refused to accept what my eyes were telling it. I closed the box and opened it again, slower this time, as though patience might somehow change the outcome. The emptiness remained. A strange heat spread through my chest, followed by a cold wave of doubt. I told myself not to panic. I reminded myself of all the times I'd misplaced things before, how memory could fail quietly without meaning harm. I searched gently at first: drawers, shelves, the edges of sinks and countertops. I checked places where the ring had never been, convincing myself that maybe, just this once, it had wandered. With every passing minute, my movements became more deliberate, my thoughts louder. Still, I said nothing. I smiled when footsteps passed my door. I answered questions in the kitchen with steady calm. No one needed to know yet, not until I was sure. As the day unfolded, I found myself watching more than speaking. Not accusing, not even suspecting outright, just observing. My son moved through the house unaware, absorbed in his own world. And then there was her, my daughter-in-law. She laughed softly at the table, scrolled through her phone, carried on as usual. Yet something in her gestures held my attention a pause too long, a glance that didn't linger. Nothing I could name, nothing I could prove. I blamed myself again for imagining things, for letting fear fill in gaps where facts didn't exist. I reminded myself of who I was, of the life I had built on patience and restraint. Stirring conflict without certainty felt like a betrayal of my own values. So I chose silence. I folded my worry neatly and placed it where no one else could see it. That night, as the house settled and shadows stretched across familiar walls, the empty box remained open on my dresser. I didn't close it. Somehow leaving it that way felt honest and unspoken acknowledgement that something had shifted, even if no one else sensed it yet. And as I lay awake, listening to the quiet breathing of the house, I understood that silence had bought me time, but it had also planted the seed of something I could no longer unfeel. Silence has a way of growing heavier when it is carried too long. Days passed, each one blending into the next, and still the ring did not return to me. Life continued on the surface, meals prepared, doors opened and closed, familiar routines repeating themselves, but beneath it all, something thick and unspoken settled into the air. I smiled when expected. I nodded when spoken to. Yet inside, my thoughts moved restlessly, circling the same unanswered question. Pretending everything was normal became its own kind of exhaustion. At the table, conversations flowed around me while I measured my words carefully, afraid that even a misplaced breath might reveal too much. My hands felt strangely empty, and I caught myself reaching for the ring without realizing it, my fingers closing around nothing. Each time it happened, a quiet ache followed, sharper because no one else could see it. I became more aware of movement of footsteps, of doors opening, of small habits I had never noticed before. My daughter-in-law crossed the house with an ease that made me uneasy. Not because she did anything wrong, but because I now noticed everything. The sound of her laughter felt louder. The way she handled my things felt more deliberate. I hated myself for thinking this way, for allowing suspicion to touch something that was once built on trust. At meals, politeness filled the space where honesty should have been. We passed dishes, exchanged routine questions, avoided each other's eyes just enough to maintain peace. My son sat between us, unaware of the tension stretching thin across the table. He spoke about his work, his plans, his future, never sensing the quiet storm gathering inches away. His distance hurt more than I expected, not because he chose it, but because he didn't know there was a choice to make. Inside me, two fears wrestled constantly. One was the fear of being wrong, of accusing an innocent person and shattering something that couldn't be rebuilt. The other was the fear of being right, of confirming that someone I had welcomed as family could hurt me so deliberately. I told myself that love required patience. That time would reveal the truth without forcing my hand. But patience, I was learning, could easily turn into avoidance as the days stretched on. The house began to feel smaller, as though its walls were quietly pressing inward. I felt alone, even in company, unheard even while speaking. Silence, once my shield, now felt like a weight on my chest. I realized that by saying nothing, I was carrying everything myself, the doubt, the fear, the growing sense of betrayal. And somewhere deep within me, a quiet understanding began to form. This silence was no longer protecting me. It was changing me, protecting me. It was changing me. By the time I noticed the first small inconsistency, I had already trained myself not to react. It slipped into my awareness quietly, the way a wrong note slips into a familiar song. A drawer left slightly open when I knew I had closed it. A pause in conversation that lingered just a moment too long. These were not events anyone else would have noticed, and that was precisely why they unsettled me. I told myself I was imagining patterns where none existed. That loss had sharpened my senses unfairly. Once, as I passed the hallway, I overheard my daughter-in-law speaking on the phone in a lowered voice. I didn't catch the words, only the tone, careful, guarded. She stopped when she noticed me, her expression smoothing out instantly. Polite as ever. I smiled back the way I always did and walked on. The house felt quieter afterward, as if it had absorbed something it wasn't meant to hear. I reminded myself that privacy was not guilt. Still, the moment stayed with me longer than it should have. Then there was the jewelry box. One afternoon, I returned to my room and saw it sitting at a slightly different angle on the dresser. Its place shifted just enough to be noticeable to someone who knew it well. My heart tightened. I stood there longer than necessary, staring at it, fighting the urge to open it again. I didn't need to. The emptiness inside had already carved itself into my memory. I told myself perhaps I had moved it without remembering. Perhaps grief was playing tricks on me. Memories began to surface, uninvited small acts of kindness. I had offered freely over the years, lending without keeping count, giving without asking why, trusting without needing reassurance. I remembered welcoming her into my home, defending her in quiet moments when others questioned her intentions. Those memories felt heavier now, not because they were wrong, but because they stood in painful contrast to the doubt I could no longer silence. Inside me, a battle continued. One part of me clung desperately to peace, to the belief that confrontation only breeds damage. The other part, quieter but growing stronger, asked how much peace was worth if it required erasing myself. I weighed every possible outcome, imagining words spoken and relationships fractured. I imagined the look on my son's face if I were mistaken. That fear alone nearly kept me silent forever. But the clues, however small, had begun to align. Not enough to accuse, not enough to prove, just enough to change something inside me. I realized that waiting was no longer neutral, it was a choice, and one that was slowly draining me. That night, as I lay awake listening to the house settle, I accepted a truth I had been avoiding. The question forming in my chest would not fade on its own. I didn't yet know how I would ask it or when. I only knew that I could feel its weight pressing forward, demanding space, demanding breath. And once a question reaches that point, it doesn't disappear. It waits, patient and relentless. For the moment, it can finally be spoken. The moment I decided to ask, the house seemed to sense it. Everything felt sharper, louder, as though the air itself had grown tense in anticipation. I waited for a time that felt ordinary enough not to raise suspicion, yet quiet enough to hold what I needed to say. My heart had been steady all day, but as the evening settled in, my body betrayed my hands slightly cold, breath measured too carefully. I told myself to stay calm. Calm had always been my strength. We were alone when it happened. Not in isolation, but in one of those shared spaces where words can echo longer than intended. I remember the way the light fell across the room, soft but unforgiving, illuminating every small detail I would later replay in my mind. I stood there for a moment longer than necessary, gathering myself, reminding myself that I wasn't accusing. I was asking. There was a difference, or at least I hoped there was. When the question finally left me, it did so quietly. No raised voice, no anger, just a simple request for truth wrapped in restraint. The kind of question that carries years of patience inside it. As soon as it was spoken, the room changed. Time stretched thin. Her expression shifted not dramatically, not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough for me. A pause, a flicker. Silence that pressed down harder than words ever could. She didn't answer right away. That hesitation felt longer than the days I had spent waiting. I watched her carefully, noticing how she avoided my eyes, how her shoulders stiffened as if bracing for impact. In that instant, something inside me sank. Not because I knew the answer yet, but because I sensed that whatever came next would not be gentle. When she did speak, Her words landed with a quiet force that knocked the air from my chest. It wasn't denial. It wasn't confusion. It was an explanation, one I had never imagined. One that reframed every polite smile, every shared meal, every act of trust I had extended. I felt heat rush to my face, followed by a numbness that spread outward, dulling everything it touched. The room felt suddenly smaller, as though the walls had moved closer to listen. I didn't interrupt her. I couldn't. My mind raced ahead of her words, connecting dots I had refused to see before. This was never just about the ring. It was about something deeper, something buried under resentment and entitlement I had mistaken for adjustment and youth. I realized then how carefully I had avoided seeing discomfort as warning. How easily love can blind when it wants harmony more than truth. When she finished, the silence returned, heavier than before. I stood there, steady on the outside, shattered beneath the surface. Years of swallowed words pressed against my ribs, demanding release. I understood with painful clarity that nothing could be undone. The life I thought I was protecting no longer existed in the same form. I left the room without another word, carrying something far heavier than loss. As I walked away, one thought followed me, persistent and cold. Once a truth like this is spoken, it doesn't stay contained. It changes everything it touches. What followed did not arrive all at once. It unfolded slowly, like a bruise darkening over time. After her explanation, I carried myself through the house as if nothing had shifted. Yet everything inside me felt rearranged. I replayed her words in fragments, not because I wanted to understand them, but because my mind refused to let them rest. Each repetition stripped away another layer of disbelief, leaving behind something colder and heavier. The grief surprised me most. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It settled quietly, pressing into my chest until even breathing felt deliberate. I mourned more than the ring. I mourned the trust I had offered so freely, the kindness I had given without hesitation. I thought of moments when I had chosen generosity over boundaries, believing love would always return love. Now, those memories felt exposed, vulnerable, almost naive. I began to see the past differently. Small interactions resurfaced, no longer harmless, but tinged with meaning I had missed before. The subtle expectations, the entitlement disguised as familiarity. I realized how carefully I had been guided into giving, how often my silence had been mistaken for permission. The realization didn't come with clarity alone, came with shame, sharp and unwanted, for not protecting myself sooner. My son occupied my thoughts more than I cared to admit. I wondered how much he knew, how much he chose not to see. I questioned whether his distance had been ignorance or convenience. Loving him made those questions painful, but avoiding them felt dishonest now. I understood that shielding him from discomfort had only left me alone with it. Anger followed grief, but it was not explosive. It was focused, steady, awakening. For the first time, I allowed myself to feel wronged without apologizing for it. I let the truth sit with me, unsoftened, unexcused. I realized how often I had absorbed discomfort so others could remain comfortable. How deeply that habit had cost me. By the end of that day, something inside me had shifted. I was still hurt, still shaken, but I was no longer willing to disappear behind silence. Whatever came next would be difficult, but it would not be carried alone anymore. As night settled in and the house grew quiet, I understood that speaking up was no longer a choice. It was a necessity. And once that decision is made, it cannot be undone. It cannot be undone. The truth has a way of surfacing even when no one invites it. Once I stopped carrying it alone, it began to move through the house on its own, settling into conversations, glances, and silences that could no longer be controlled. I didn't announce anything. I didn't demand attention. I simply stopped protecting what had already harmed me. And in doing so, the balance shifted. When my son finally sensed that something was wrong, it wasn't because I told him it was because I no longer softened my presence to keep him comfortable. My words became fewer, my tone firmer, my eyes no longer quick to look away. The questions came slowly, cautiously, and when they did, I answered with restraint, offering truth without decoration. Watching realization dawn on his face was more painful than I expected. Not because he doubted me, but because he had never thought to look. My daughter-in-law changed once the truth was no longer private. Her composure thinned. Politeness slipped where it once held firm. The confidence she carried so easily began to fracture under quiet scrutiny. No accusations were thrown. No voices were raised. But the air between us grew charged, heavy with what could no longer be hidden. In that space, power shifted, not dramatically, but undeniably. I felt it most in myself. The familiar urge to retreat, to apologize, to smooth things over never arrived. Instead, there was stillness, a calm that came from finally standing in my own experience without shrinking it. I didn't need to justify my pain. I didn't need to convince anyone. The truth once spoken carried its own weight. Consequences began unfolding quietly. Conversations ended sooner than they used to. Laughter no longer filled the same rooms. Choices had to be acknowledged, even if no one named them aloud. And through it all, I remained present. Not hardened, not cruel, just honest. For the first time, I understood that strength did not require force. It required refusal to be erased as the house settled into this new reality. I felt something unfamiliar but grounding take root inside me. I had not won anything. I had not reclaimed what was lost. But I had reclaimed myself. And though the air still felt heavy, it no longer felt suffocating. Still, I knew this was not the end. Truth changes things, yes, but it also demands something in return. And what that demand would cost us all had yet to fully reveal itself. Time did what it always does, moved forward, indifferent to what it leaves behind. The house slowly learned a new rhythm, one shaped not by comfort but by honesty. The ring never returned to its place, and eventually I stopped opening the box expecting it to be there. Its absence no longer startled me. It simply existed, like a scar that no longer aches but never quite disappears. Relationships shifted in ways both visible and subtle. Some conversations became careful, others faded entirely. There was no dramatic reconciliation, no perfect ending wrapped in forgiveness. Instead, there was distance where closeness once lived, and clarity where confusion had ruled. I learned that closure does not always arrive as reliefs. Sometimes it arrives as acceptance. Quiet and uncompromising. I grieved what could not be repaired. Not just the ring, but the version of family I had believed in for so long. Letting go of that image hurt more than any confrontation ever could. Yet in that letting go, I felt something unexpected. Space. Space to breathe without shrinking, to exist without explaining myself. To value my own boundaries as much as I had once valued peace. The lessons came slowly. Earned through discomfort rather than wisdom. I learned that love without limits invites erosion. That silence, when used to avoid conflict, eventually avoids the self. I understood that self-worth does not announce itself loudly, it settles in once you stop abandoning it for the sake of others. These truths did not make me bitter. They made me steady. Sometimes I still think of the ring, of the life it witnessed, of the hand it once rested on. But I no longer measure my worth by what was taken from me. What remains is stronger than gold. It is the quiet knowledge that I can stand in truth without fear, that I can endure loss without losing myself now. When I move through my days, I do so differently, slower, more deliberate, carrying the past without being controlled by it. The ring may be gone, but in its place, I found something I didn't know I had misplaced for years, my voice. And once you find that, nothing can truly take it from you again. Take it from you again.